Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, students. So, once again, it's me, and I've got yet another riveting lecture for you as it relates to personal boundaries, personal and professional boundaries. As social workers, as newer social workers, it is very important for you to really understand that the nature of the work that we do as social workers is unique in a lot of different ways. It's built on being able to establish therapeutic, meaningful relationships with people because it's through the quality of the relationship that the actual growth and change for families actually happens. Also, we have to be careful about what those boundaries looks like because we're humans. We have our own flaws and have our own ways of saying things, but we need to be very careful because as professionals, we're held to a higher standard. So let's talk about and take a look at um, what we need to be doing as it relates to professional and personal boundaries, knowing the difference, and because it could create issues for us in our profession. All right, so let's talk about boundaries. So when we talk about boundaries, we're basically looking at, if we think about the definition, it's something that indicates that there's a border, there's a point by which you just don't go past. So it limits what's coming in, what's going out. It limits what relationships need to look like. The NASW Code of Ethics establishes many boundaries that directly impact the scope of our work. And so, as we spend some time at a later date looking at the Code of Ethics, it really sets some pretty high standards for how we connect, when we connect, with whom we connect, and under what circumstances we connect. And so, we need to be very mindful of that and as we move towards our practice in terms of working with families. So, some questions for you to think about. Um, how effective are you at establishing and maintaining boundaries in your personal life? So let's think about that for a minute. Um, Typically, what I tend to hear is that social workers, being the social beings that we are, tend to have a problem saying no. So when people ask us to do things, we feel a certain level of obligation because we want to help, right? That's what we do. Um, but oftentimes that inability to establish a boundary can create issues for us in that we often overextend ourselves by not being able to say no when we need to. So think about that. If you think about your journey as a social worker, your student in class, think about all the responsibilities that you have on your plate right now, family, home, work, school, among other things. And then think about how often you're asked or put upon to do things and how often you are unable or to say yes or to say no to those particular circumstances. So again, that's going to be really important because if you have difficulty managing your own personal boundaries, it's going to be even more difficult for you to manage boundaries when you're working with your client. So just something for you to think about. The other thing is, how do you think this will affect your ability to create effective boundaries in your professional relationship? So if I can't do it at home, can I do it with a client who just needs, a ride to the store after work hours? It's on your way home and it's not going to kill you to do it, but this is like the third time this week that we've had this conversation. How do you mitigate that? So those are just some things for you to think about in the context of the work that you will be doing. So let's talk about dual and multiple relationships. So in this work, we're all human beings, we're all human creatures, we all rely on human relationships to some degree or another. And you need to understand that as a social worker, you will have relationships with your clients, but some of those could be dual relationships that sometimes just happen uh, coincidentally, and we need to be able to manage those relationships. So, what am I talking about by dual relationship? Um, so, for an example, might be here's what I've got. I've got may assume more than one professional role, like instructor or supervisor or coworker. Um, Let me give you a scenario. So, what happens now that you're a social worker? and you have clients, and let's say you work in a children and family service area and you have a caseload of families that have been referred to you because they are having some difficulties, and your job is to provide resources and to improve family functioning, right? It happens. So you attend church. And 2 Sundays ago, one of your clients actually joined church. So now they're a church member, just like you're a church member, but also you're their social worker. So right now we have a dual relationship because you have a professional responsibility to provide service for this particular client, and now you are part of a religious organization where you're looked upon as brothers and sisters. How do you mitigate that? What do you need to do to make sure that those lines don't get blurred? Because you don't stop becoming a social worker just because you're at church on Sunday, or nor do you become a social worker just because when you're at church. So think about it from that standpoint. So when you're providing treatment for a relative or a friend, a church member where a client attends, socializing with clients, becoming emotionally or sexually involved with a former client. These are all multiple relationships and they can be problematic, especially when we start to look at working with relatives and friends. So if you had to think for a minute, so what's the issue if I'm a trained social worker? Why can't I work with my family and my niece and nephew when they're having an issue? Well, part of the issue is that from an ethical standpoint, you have a previous relationship with your niece and your nephew who are having the issue. You may have a bias about who might be in the right and who might be in the wrong. So, can you effectively be neutral and provide quality services for your relatives when you've got a previous existing relationship with them? Probably can't do it because you've got a bias one way or another. So, again, it's those kind of things that we need to be thinking about as social workers. And some of the ones that are their latter here, becoming emotionally and or sexually involved with a former client, that's a huge, huge issue, and a lot of people end up losing their licensure because of that. So those are things that you need to be careful and watch for, that you're always held in the standard of the professional. And so if anything goes down as it relates to you and your work with your client, you're going to be the one that's going to be held responsible. So just think about that for a moment. You also want to have some guidelines for setting boundaries. So informed consent is used to, state, your policy regarding professional versus social and school business relationships. Involve your client in setting boundaries about what you can expect for them and what they expect of them. Consult with your colleagues to get an objective perspective. Use supervision when you find yourself in these situations. Informed consent when you're in more than one role. Document discussions regarding multiple or dual relationships. So when we talked about the situation where, so I'll share a personal piece with you because it comes up. I attend a church. I also have foster parents that used to attend this particular church when I was a child protection worker and a supervisor. I also had one of my employees who I supervised who went to this particular church. And then I had a client who actually went to this church. So think about that. So I got a foster care person who I have a relationship, I've got a client who I've got a relationship, and I got a person that I supervise, and we're in a different setting. So what I had to do was I had to have a conversation with all of them about what the relationship needed to look like. So this whole informed consent. So it's like, when I'm at church, this is the relationship that we have. We're not talking about your case. We're not talking about foster kids. We're not talking about any of those things. We're not talking about any work stuff while we're in church. This is a different setting. These are the boundaries that we have to actually have. Can everybody live with that whole piece? And then when we're not in church, this is what the expectation is because there's a difference in terms of how we respond and treat each other. So it's about being real clear and transparent and documenting when those kind of things come up. Combining the personal and professional. So if you think about, is it okay to go to a lunch with a client? Hmm, good question. What's the answer? The answer might be that, yeah, it is okay to go to a lunch with a client, depending on what the circumstances are, depending on what the relationship. depending on what the intent is. Why am I taking you to lunch? Is it to have a meeting to talk about the relationship that you're having with your kid and you can't do it at home in a safe environment? That might work. I buy my lunch, you buy yours. Bartering with clients, sometimes clients don't have money, so they might want to do in-kind services. If you are providing case management for a family and dad's a mechanic and they're short this month, maybe he can tune your car up. These are things that we have to be very careful about and get supervision and guidance as we do those kind of things. Socializing with clients, in some instances that might be okay, in others it may not be. Sexual relationships with former clients, I would just say no. Just don't even go down that particular road. It just opens too many cans of worms and you're too liable. Understanding the cultural context. So, for example, where I grew up in a largely African American community in the South, um, there's this ritual around food. So it was not uncommon that when I visited with clients in their home doing home visits, I'd get offered dinner, or I'd get offered dessert, or I'd get offered a beer. I mean, it's all of those things. And so I had to kind of think about, like, so what do I do? Because Southern culture says that if I turn down food, I'm being rude. So what do I do? How do I address that issue? Does the agency have a standpoint on what we need to be doing? If I'm going to enhance the relationship and gather more information about how to help this family, and a meal will help do that, maybe it may not be an inappropriate thing to do. Accepting and receiving gifts. Someone's going to buy you a new Mercedes, you probably don't want to take that, or Rolex or anything along those lines. But you also need to check with your agency around what their policy is around gifts. And to be safe, it's probably just not a good idea. Several years ago, when I first started teaching, I had two students who, well, there are a couple of incidents, for example. I had some students who wanted to work on a research project and they were going to present, and the only time they could get together was Saturday. So I said, I'll come to campus, I'll open up the classroom for you, I'll hang around, let you guys practice what you're going to do, whole 9 yards. They were really happy and graceful. A week later, they show up in my office with a gift card, thanking me for allowing them to use the space and to come in on my Saturday. And I had to say to them, I can't accept your gift card. I appreciate the gesture, but we have a relationship. I'm your professor, you're my student. It it just doesn't pass the smell test. And so while I appreciate that, we can maybe donate that gift card to some other needy organization. I had an incident at one point in time where some students got me a Christmas gift and a tie, which was very nice. And I was like, but I can't accept it. So I ended up putting it in a drawer to donate later. I found it years later, and then I took it to Goodwill after the fact because it had been there so long I forgot all about it. But again, it's those kind of things that you want to be very careful about in terms of looking at those types of relationships. So learning when to say yes, learning when to say no, learning when to take control of your life are going to be the things that are going to determine whether you're going to be a successful social worker with longevity or whether you're going to crash and burn right away. So learn to do those things. Um, so that concludes what I have for you as it relates to boundaries. So go out there, be safe. When in doubt, ask questions, do your readings. So when you come to class, we can be prepared to have some rich and wonderful dialogue. Talk to you soon.